What's up, psychedelic investors? Today we have a fantastic episode for you, and that is because MindMed released some details about not one of their phase 1 clinical trials, but actually 2 different phase 1 clinical trials. So I'm super excited to share with you guys what they shared with the world, and we'll get into that in just a second. But first, as always, you already know, if you enjoy this video, like, subscribe, share with your mom, show it to your dog, comment, hit the notifications bell, hit the button. You guys already know what to do. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm sure you will. So let's get into it. So this morning, MindMed put out a press release. I'll go ahead and throw that up on the screen now. It says, MindMed and Liechti Lab provide results from their psilocybin R&D collaboration. Now, just a little bit of background information. I'm sure most of you know this, but in case you don't, MindMed and the Liechti Lab in Basel, Switzerland, have come to an agreement where all of the different work that the scientist, Dr. Matthias Liechti, is working on, MindMed has the rights to, the intellectual property rights to, in exchange for funding all of his different projects. And I'm sure that if these different LSD projects do turn out to be as effective as we think they are right now, then in the end of the day, he's going to be a very rich man. So basically every different LSD project you hear about that MindMed is working on is done throughout this Liechti collaboration at the Hospital Basel University in Switzerland. So let's get into the article. And we're not going to read all of it, but maybe most of it. The most important parts you'll see here. I have a lot of stuff highlighted, so let's get into it. Dr. Matthias Liechti presented data from several ongoing studies at the Insight conference in Berlin, Germany. So that's kind of how it works in the scientific world. Before results of a study are published, oftentimes the authors of it will go to prestigious conferences and they'll present their findings, and that's what happened here. So Dr. Liechti presented his findings, or at least preliminary findings, at this conference. Unfortunately, we don't know everything that he said in this conference. All we get is a little excerpt of it. We get a few sentences on each of the things he talked about. So this isn't a full understanding and breakdown of everything he talked about, but it is still interesting nevertheless. These investigator-initiated studies are being conducted as part of MindMed's ongoing collaboration with the UHB Liechti Lab. So that's what we just talked about. So now it's time to get into the good stuff. What are these trial results? What are the trials, first of all, and what are the results that they presented in Germany? Well, the first one is the comparative effects of LSD and psilocybin. So we're going to pause here because, as you can see, it doesn't actually say much, and we are going to get to the results of what they talked about in a second. But first, we are switching over here to the study itself. And we've talked about this before. It's the direct comparison of altered states of consciousness induced by LSD and psilocybin. So let's just scroll down and read a little bit about what this study is trying to accomplish before we then go back and look at the results, just so we can kind of base ourselves, so we can get a little bit of context before diving into the results so that we understand what's going on. Alright, so it says here, LSD and psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, are widely used for recreational purposes. Both substances also increasingly used in psychiatric and psychological research. However, it has never been studied whether there are differences in alterations in mind produced by these two substances. Both LSD and psilocybin are thought to induce hallucinations primarily via stimulation of the 5-HT2A receptor. Now, I'm going to pause here. Again, remember that MindMed also did a study on the 5-HT2A receptor that was looking at if yours is more active or less active, how much that will affect your experience to psychedelics, specifically MDMA in that scenario, but also other psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin. And they found that if you have a less active 5-HT2A receptor, this is an enzyme in your brain, it breaks down the psychedelics, metabolizes them. If yours is less active, you're more likely to be susceptible to having more extreme trips, or you're just more susceptible to the drugs in general. So yeah, they're saying here that LSD and psilocybin both work on this receptor. However, there are differences in the receptor activation profiles between the two substances that may also induce different subjective effects. LSD potently stimulates the 5-HT2A receptor, but also the 5-HT2BC and 5-HT21 and D1 3 receptors. Psilocin, the active metabolite of the prodrug psilocybin, also stimulates the 5-HT2A receptor, but additionally inhibits the 5-HT transporter. So basically what they're saying is that the two drugs have different effects. We know that they both affect the one receptor in your brain, but LSD affects other ones that psilocybin inhibits. And there's never really been a study on the difference between these before, so MindMed decided to go ahead and study it. So it says here, therefore the investigation will compare the acute effects of LSD, psilocybin, and a placebo. Scrolling down a little bit here, we can see this is a phase 1 trial, so primarily focused on safety, and it's not the hugest sample size. As we can see, there were only 28 participants, and some of them would have got the placebo. Scrolling down even more, we can take a look at the outcome measures, what they're actually looking to gather in this study, and we can see that the number one outcome measure is altered states of consciousness. So basically, how strong the different drugs affect you, and how much of one drug does it take to get you to the same level of psychedelic experience as the other drug. On top of this primary outcome, we have a lot of secondary outcomes, which are in many ways more interesting and exciting, and what I'm excited to hear about. So of course we have the subjective effects, as we can see here. So that would just be basically, what do you feel when you're on these substances? People who have taken both LSD and psilocybin before will know that they affect you somewhat differently, so they just kind of want to figure out how they affect you differently. We're not going to go through all of these secondary outcomes, there's like 20 of them, but one of the most important ones, in my opinion, here is number 6, effects on emotion processing. So this will be really important for therapy settings, because we want to know how well these different drugs are, how effective they are in a therapy setting. That's what this is all about. How well can LSD treat, say, depression as compared to psilocybin? So that seems to be the most interesting and important secondary outcome measure to me. They also have a bunch of autonomic effects, such as your heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, etc. So, understanding now, or with the understanding that we now have of what this entire study was about, comparing psilocybin and LSD, let's hop back to the other article here and read what Dr. Liechti presented in his presentation in Germany. It says here, the perceptual effects of a dose of 100 micrograms of LSD were found to be equivalent to a dose of 200 milligrams of psilocybin in healthy volunteers. This is the first direct clinical evidence demonstrating the equivalence of psilocybin and LSD on acute psychedelic effects. So that's it. That's all that us, the public, gets to know about this study for now. They're going to publish the results later in the year, so we'll find out more then. But of all the different cool things that they were looking for in the study, the only one that they decided that the public should know right now is how much LSD equals how much psilocybin. So I know that people that are kind of in the world of recreational psychedelics, this has been a big question for a long time, like what is the potency difference between psilocybin and LSD? And now we actually have a scientific answer. To get to the same level of psychedelic experience, you need to take 20 milligrams of psilocybin. That's, by the way, pure psilocybin. That's not necessarily, or that isn't dried shrooms, but you need to take 20 milligrams of psilocybin to have the same dose amount as 100 micrograms of LSD. So that is definitely interesting. Again, it will be more interesting in the future when we get results on how it affects people emotionally and how it may translate to a therapy setting. But again, that is a cool little tidbit of information that was released. So the second study that Dr. Liechti presented upon in Germany was about psychedelics and SSRIs. And I'm actually not 100% sure if we've covered this on the channel before or not. I did a little bit of digging back into our history. I didn't seem to see any episode about this study, so we're just going to go through it here. So the title of the study was Effects of SERT Inhibition on Subjective Response to Psilocybin in Healthy Subjects. And we can see here psilocybin is classical serotonin. Stick with me, guys. I'm going to get the word, I promise. Serotonergic. Wow. Serotonergic. hallucinogen. I'm pretty sure I'm saying that word wrong still. Serotonergic hallucinogen acting on the 5-HT2A receptor. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, the most common form of treatment for depression, like escitalopram, are first-line treatments for depression. They inhibit the serotonin transporter, which is the SERT in the title. This might cause a possible downregulation of postsynaptic 5-HT receptors, example, the 5-HT2A receptor. The aim of this study is to investigate the effects of psilocybin after an SSRI and placebo are treated. Subjective and psychological effects, as well as effects on gene expression, will be assessed. So to be clear, what this study is looking at isn't whether psilocybin is better than an SSRI at treating depression. What it's looking at is what are the effects of taking psilocybin when you're already on an SSRI. Is it better to be on an SSRI when you're taking psilocybin, or is it worse to be on SSRI when you're taking psilocybin? So that was the purpose of this, as you can see here, phase 1 clinical trial. A little important piece that we picked out of the longer description here is that several studies suggest a possible downregulation of postsynaptic serotonin 5-HT receptors, such as the 5-HT2A receptor. The aim of this study is to assess whether SERT inhibition reduces expression of the gene coding for the 5-HT2A receptor and the response to psilocybin. Here we can see that it's a very small trial, only 27 participants, and again, some of them would have had a placebo, although I believe there that the placebo would be a placebo filling in for the SSRI and not the psilocybin. So everybody would have been on the psilocybin, I do believe. Alrighty, we can see the primary outcome measurement that they were looking at for this study is the 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness. So here it says that they're looking at a visual analog scale consisting of 94 items, constructed of 5 scales, and allows assessing mood, anxiety, derealization, depersonalization, changes in perception, auditory alterations, and reduced vigilance. So again, they're looking at 5 different things, comparing whether it's better to just take psilocybin as compared to psilocybin with an SSRI. Mood, anxiety, derealization, depersonalization, changes in perception, auditory alterations, and reduced vigilance. They also, of course, have secondary measures, which, again, are often more interesting than the primary outcome, such as how it affects your mood, such as your state of consciousness, how it affects possible schizophrenic specific dimensions, and again, your bodily variables such as blood pressure, heart rate, all of that good stuff. There's like 13 of them here. We're not going to get into all of them. So getting back to the results that they released of this study, looking at whether or not it is better to be on an SSRI when you're taking a psilocybin or not. And again, remember, it's a small study. Let me just find it here, guys. Sorry, perfect. I don't know if I'm going to edit that out or not, but cool. So yeah, psychedelics and SSRIs. Psilocybin was found to be safe to administer together with an antidepressant. Great. So nobody's heads exploded or anything, or no adverse side effects in the 27 people that they didn't expect. Completely safe to take psilocybin with SSRIs. Daily pre-treatment with escitalopram, and that's the SSRI, for 2 weeks prior to psilocybin administration reduced anxiety and blood pressure increases associated with psilocybin, but did not reduce the acute psychedelic experience in healthy volunteers. So let's break that down for a second. The first part of that sentence said that for the people who took the SSRI daily for 2 weeks before their administration of psilocybin, they had, let me back up a second. So in previous studies, there have been shown when you take psilocybin in some people, it actually increases their anxiety levels and their blood pressure, which obviously is no bueno. We don't want that. We want your blood pressure to be good. We want there to be no increased anxiety, especially if you're using this to treat something like anxiety, obviously. So what they found here was that when they combined an SSRI with their psilocybin, the increases in anxiety and blood pressure that they saw in some people when they were on psilocybin actually disappeared when they were also on SSRIs. And then on top of that, the second part of the sentence here, it says that it did not affect the psychedelic experience in the healthy volunteers. So it was a little bit better. It had less anxiety, less high blood pressure or raising of blood pressure, and it did not affect the psychedelic experience, completely safe to take. So that seems like it was a pretty successful study. Again, I'm not really sure how I personally would feel about combining the two drugs. I would like to think that psilocybin might be a good replacement for SSRIs, but if the science ends up showing that it's better to take the two in tandem, then so be it. So let's get into a couple quotes here, and this is for the press release, not quotes from the actual conference. So starting with Dr. Liechti here, it says, while both LSD and psilocybin have a long history in psychiatric research, psilocybin is being studied in a majority of ongoing clinical trials of psychedelics. It is important for us to understand the acute effect characteristics of different psychedelics and to understand how these substances interact with other treatments like antidepressants. We look forward to fully analyzing the exciting data produced by these studies and publishing our findings later this year. So again, the full findings are going to be published later this year. Very excited to dig into them. It seems like we are going to have a lot of exciting data here, albeit again with the caveat that the sample sizes are small. Moving on to what they call MindMed CEO Robert Barrow, and I'll just put a little note here that very inconspicuously the word temporary CEO is missing. It just says their CEO, so I don't know, take that for what it's worth. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's everything, I don't know. But Rob Barrow said, investors and researchers alike are eager to understand the similarities between psilocybin and LSD. Learning how these substances compare and interact with other drugs helps us ensure that our treatment programs are as effective and efficient as possible. And moving on to the executive president of MindMed, Dr. Miri Wernley, who honestly always has the best quotes at the end of every press release. She says, the psychedelic experience can be conceptualized as the facilitated, transforming encounter between one's fears and longings with the universe and its network of living processes. Poetic. This work with Professor Liechti indicating, for example, that genetic polymorphisms of CYP2D6. So here she's referring to the previous study that we talked about, the study where they looked at how active your CYP2D6 enzyme was correlated to how acutely psychedelics will affect you. So she says of CYP2D6, significantly influences the pharmacokinetic and subjective effects of LSD is an illustration that biological and psychological transformation processes may be deeply interwoven. When LSD is the chosen key to open an opportunity for psychotransformation and growth, individual parameters such as one's own metabolization and biotransformation rhythm have to be carefully understood and taken into consideration in order to allow the transformative effect to happen in the most powerful and safe manner. So there you have it, guys. This is very exciting. We got a little bit of information on a couple of the different phase 1 clinical trials that MindMed is doing, even if we didn't get all the information in the world. And I guess just as closing thoughts, I'll just bring in the idea of one of the reasons that I personally, and not financial advice, but I personally really like the company of MindMed is because they're working on so many different projects. They're not just working on one different way to treat anxiety, or they're not just working on, say, psilocybin to treat depression. They've got literally dozens of different projects using different compounds, combining different compounds, seeing how different compounds interact with each other, and super importantly, that we haven't talked about yet, seeing how your genetics affect your interaction with psychedelics. So that was what the whole CYP2D6 thing was about, was how your personal genome and genetics may affect your experiences on psychedelics. And obviously that makes perfect sense in retrospect, but we need scientific studies on it. The future of medicine, not just psychedelics, but the future of medicine is going to be personalized. If me and you have the same condition, but I have a completely different genetic makeup than you do, I am, let's say, bigger than you are, maybe I'm a guy, you're a woman, we shouldn't necessarily be receiving the exact same treatment. Maybe something will work better for me then will work for you and vice versa. So we need to understand how our own individual bodies work before prescribing medicine, and that is part of what MindMed is working on here. Personalized medicine is going to completely take over the entire medicine industry over the next decade. Definitely go listen to some Kathy Wood talks on this. She definitely breaks it down better than I do. But this is extremely exciting news. And again, the two big takeaways from this press release are we now know how much LSD equals psilocybin. Again, it's 100 micrograms of LSD is equal to 20 milligrams of psilocybin. And then it is apparently safe to take an SSRI with psilocybin, and it actually reduces anxiety and blood pressure increases that are associated with psilocybin. So again, super exciting news. I guess that's all for today. I don't really have anything else to comment on it. I just wanted to get this video out to you guys, so I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you made it to the end of the video. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that comment button. I hope you actually type something. You don't just hit the comment button. But if you do, if you just want to hit a space button and then comment, you can feel free to do that too. It's engagement. I love it. I love you, and I will see you next time.